The conditionals in English are sets of sentences that express possibilities, hypothetical situations, and consequences. Because humans have the capacity to hypothesize, we have conditional sentences, also known as if clauses, that refer to hypothetical situations and their projected consequences. In one way, they are a type of a complex sentence having two parts: a condition that begins with the word if and a result. The condition sets up a situation, and the result says what will happen if that situation occurs. In English, there are four types of conditionals, and understanding these is very important because they're used exceptionally in English conversations and writing. There is type 0, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 0 expresses facts and truths, type 1 shows real possibilities, type 2 represents unreal or improbable situations, and type 3 exhibits past hypothetical possibilities. Each conditional has a unique structure and a general understanding of how it works, and in the video, I'll explain every single one. Conditional type 0 is the easiest because it simply expresses facts, general truths, and possible situations in the present tense, specifically in the present simple. It is not about specific situations in the past or future, it's about what's always true in the present. The pattern for conditional type 0 is very simple. We begin with the word if that shows a condition, continue with a present simple condition, which is a phrasal fragment, followed by a comma, and then a present simple result, which is an ordinary sentence. If plus a fragment in the present simple plus a sentence in the present simple. Here is an example. If you heat ice, it melts. This sentence is simple because the conditional fragment is if you heat ice, and the result is it melts. Conditional type 0 is a general truth, so it's always the case that if you heat ice, it melts. Other examples are, if I mix blue and yellow, I get green. If it is a weekday, he goes to work. If we don't eat, we get hungry. This is how conditional type 0 works, and it's actually not used a lot in English conversations due to its simplicity. As humans, we want to express more information, especially about events that could happen, so we depend on other types of conditions. One thing to note about type 0 is that it cannot be continuous because it expresses facts that are usually stated in the present simple, making the present continuous not suitable for its intended meaning. However, it's possible to use it to give commands that are contingent on a certain circumstance, specifically in the result. Some examples are, if it rains, bring an umbrella. If you leave, take your bag. If you come to the party, don't forget about the food. Interestingly, English commands, also known as the imperative mood, are verbs that make a demand, request, or give advice. They will be explained in the next video, and they're one of the easiest topics in all English grammar. Using them in conditions will not hurt anybody, especially considering that conditions with commands are the most common type. Conditional type 1 expresses real possible situations that can happen at some point in the future. It is not about general truths, it's about what can or will happen in the future. Since the future is not entirely predictable, these sentences act more as possible situations that probably will happen. The pattern for conditional type 1 begins with if, continues with a present simple condition, and then a result in the future simple. If plus a fragment in the present simple plus a sentence in the future simple, consisting of the auxiliary verb will and an infinitive. Here's an example. If it rains, I will stay at home. In the sentence, the conditional fragment is if it rains, and the result is I will stay at home. This is a real possibility because we don't know if it will happen, yet it's very likely. It can rain, and if it does, I will stay at home. Other examples are, if you study hard, you will pass the exam. If I see her, I will say hello. If they don't hurry, they will miss the bus. If I fall asleep, I will miss my favorite show. if my car doesn't start, I will be late. Unlike type 0, conditional type 1 is used way more because it expresses ideas in the future, so this type is heard way more in English conversations. Also, type 1 can be continuous because it can emphasize the ongoing nature of a condition. Instead of using the present simple, we can use the present continuous in the fragment of the if clause, which will be the verb to be with an infinitive with ing. One example is, if you are studying now, you will pass the test. Conditional type 2 represents unreal or improbable situations showing what could happen hypothetically rather than what can happen. Essentially, type 2 talks about events that are unlikely to happen but theoretically possible. And this makes a big difference because we have to introduce a new word that I haven't discussed before, and that is would. This word, would, is actually the past version of will, but it generates new meanings and is arguably the most important word in the English conditionals. Would functions exactly like will in terms of subjects, and it also has a contraction, an apostrophe with the last letter of would. I'd go, you'd go, he'd go, she'd go, it'd go, we'd go, and they'd go. What's special about would is that it expresses the conditional mood, indicating the result of a hypothetical event. Would allows speakers to express past willingness, polite requests, and habitual actions in the past, adding nuance to communication. This way, conditions don't show facts, but convey what could happen. The pattern for conditional type 2 begins with if, continues with a past simple fragment, and then a result in the conditional mood. Now, we're changing the form to something that hypothetically can happen, but is unlikely. We have to make a sentence that consists of would and an infinitive, and together they will act as the conditional result. If plus a fragment in the past simple plus a sentence in the conditional mood, consisting of would and an infinitive. Here's an example. If I won the lottery, I would buy a house. In this sentence, the conditional fragment is if I won the lottery, and the result is I would buy a house. That's an unreal or improbable situation because I probably will not win the lottery, but if I did, I would buy a house. The event can hypothetically happen, but is very unlikely. This is what makes conditional type 2, and in fact, the English subjunctive, another future topic, is entirely based on hypothetical situations. The subjunctive in English is very difficult to understand, even at the highest level, so I will not show it with conditionals because it will be too much. Plus, the subjunctive tends to break grammar, so I will explain it in a future video. Other examples in conditional type 2 are, if I worked hard, I would never quit. If she had a good teacher, she would pass the class. If it snowed in a desert, it would be a miracle. Conditional type 2 is also used a lot because it expresses hypothetical possibilities, and as humans, we think a lot about what would happen if something else happened. Conditional type 2 can also be continuous, emphasizing the duration of an action that could take place. Instead of using the past simple, we can use the past continuous, and since we'll have an ongoing action, would will function exactly how will functions in the future continuous. So essentially, it's a continuous conditional mood. An example of that is, if you were studying abroad, you would be having a good time. Ultimately, conditional type 2 doesn't have any past, present, or future perfect tenses. There's a big reason why I'm saying this, because the last type, in the conditionals, will utilize perfect tenses, and it's arguably the hardest to understand. Conditional type 3 exhibits past hypothetical possibilities that are entirely improbable. By far, it's the most complex conditional because it has perfect tenses with completely unreal situations in the past. It's not about what happened, but what could have happened, basically talking about things that are impossible. This is why in my past perfect video, I said that the past perfect will be very useful in the if clause because conditional type 3 requires if, a past perfect fragment, and a result that is in the conditional perfect. Fundamentally, conditional type 3 entirely consists of conditions, both in the fragment and result. Here, we're changing the form to something that could have or would have happened but never actually happened. We have to make a sentence that consists of would, the verb have, and a past participle. Together, it will act as a conditional perfect result. If plus a fragment in the past perfect plus a sentence in the conditional perfect, consisting of would have and a past participle. Let's analyze the example that I gave in my past perfect video. If I had woken up, I would have had time. In the sentence, the conditional fragment is if I had woken up, and the result is I would have had time. This is a completely unreal situation because I did not wake up and I did not have time, which means that the idea is something that never happened. However, if I had woken up in the past, I would have had time in the past. The entire situation is in the past, so conditional type 3 is only used for past events that could have happened but did not. This is why the past perfect in an if clause describes a hypothetical condition, and the conditional perfect, would have, and a past participle describes the result that could have happened but never did. Another example is, if I had known about it, I would have gone to the party. Because the sentence is in conditional type 3, it signifies that the party is over, so it's too late to go. If I had known about it, I would have gone to it, but ultimately, I never did. It was a situation that I could have changed, but I did not, which means that the event is completely impossible to change. Here are more examples. If he had not forgotten his wallet, he would have paid the bill. If she had seen the sign, she would not have parked here. If we had left earlier, we would have caught the bus. Conditional type 3 is also used a lot, but not as much as the previous types. Because it shows a completely impossible situation, it's not something that is discussed typically, but it's still used in daily conversations. Conditional type 3 can also be continuous, and in that case, we can use the past perfect continuous, and the result with would will also be continuous. In this context, would will make the conditional perfect continuous and create a would have been doing construction in the result, describing an unrealized continuous past action. An example of that is, if I had been studying harder, I would have been feeling more confident. The conditional perfect continuous is an extremely rare tense in English conversations and writing. Not only is it hard to understand when to use it, but it's also hard to remember how it's constructed. After learning a lot of English grammar and the previous conditional types, I would recommend slowly approaching conditional type 3 because it's very difficult to comprehend even for native English speakers, let alone the continuous. At the highest level, it's very, very rare. So for beginners, I would not recommend it at all. But if you have a substantial knowledge of English grammar, you can try to understand type 3 using a way that fits you. Aside from the typical conditional types, English also has mixed conditionals and inverted structures. At this point, we're getting into the highest level of English, which focuses more on how English sounds in conversation rather than on paper. On a grammatical level, it would be extremely difficult to understand these concepts, so it's better to listen to spoken English because the variations between them can change a lot. I would highly advise to not focus on grammatical conditionals and not rush them. Instead, listen to how these concepts can change when spoken, but it's still very important to understand them. So, I will not elaborate a lot on these ideas, but it's still significant to see how they work, particularly in speech. Mixed conditionals in English are a blend of type 2 and type 3, and they're used when the time reference in the fragment is not the same as in the result. Native English speakers tend to mix these types to talk about present hypothetical results of past events that may or may not have happened. One example is, if I had worked harder, I would be in a better job. This sentence has a type 3 fragment in the past perfect with a type 2 conditional mood in the result. This mix is often used in speech, so it's something that makes the flow of conversations better. For beginners, I would not recommend focusing on that, but for native speakers, it's something to consider. Still, if you can identify it as a conditional, you're doing very well. But for non-native speakers, you don't need to know whether it's a type 2 or 3, as long as you can tell that it's a conditional. Additionally, English has inverted conditionals with formal structures. An inverted conditional is mainly a type 3 that inverts the subject and the auxiliary verbs in the fragment without using the word if. Had I known, I would have acted differently. In this context, the sentence is not a question, but a formal structure that is used in spoken and written English, and that is as far as I will go. In summary, the English conditionals allow us to talk about all the possibilities that can happen and impossibilities that could happen. When expressing something in any conditional, nothing limits you but your imagination, so you can say whatever you want or wanted in a hypothetical situation. As a side note, many examples that I gave throughout the video had other English concepts that could have been combined, like contractions and writing. I decided to not include them with the conditionals because it would take away the emphasis and could have confused some of you. So, I decided to stick with what I showed, and if you want, you can go back and reevaluate every example using other English concepts.